Let's dig in. Welcome to these reform of fiscal rules, lessons learned. We know that this is a key issue for the future of the European Union, a key discussion that we're going to have over the next few months. And we want to set the tone as well. We're going to have a public discussion today with representatives of the European Commission, the Parliament, but also the member states to dig into this question indeed. Before we jump into the conversation, a few housekeeping rules. First of all, this is an open conversation for all of you who are participating today. So make sure that if you have any question or comment that you would like to share with our speakers a little bit later in the panel session today, you do it via our chat. Please keep your cameras off and your microphones off so that we can have our discussion in peace. And be aware that we are recording this event today. I don't want to take much of the time in this introduction. I want to jump straight away into this conversation. And for that, I'm going to give the floor first to Markus Martin-Bauer, who is the Chief Economist of the Austrian Chamber of Labour.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Beatrice. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Austrian Chamber of Labour and the Austrian Trade Union Federation to our webinar on the reform of the European fiscal rules. The upcoming economic governance review offers the opportunity for a big step forward into a successful socio-ecological transformation of the European model, and fiscal rules, of course, play an important role in this process. We will discuss the necessities and the starting points of fiscal reform in detail today with a panel of distinguished scholars from academics and politics who will be introduced later on. The reform of the fiscal rules is quite pressing, but the circumstances, from my point of view, are rather favorable. Firstly, the fight against climate crisis and inequality requires trillions of euro in private, but also especially in public investment within the next years. Secondly, financial conditions for these investments are favorable, as interest rates are zero or even negative and will stay in this terrain for the next years. Thirdly, there exists a window of opportunity concerning the political framework, with a Commission eager to go forward, a Parliament with a strong commitment to reform, and an incoming new government in Germany on which lots of hopes are based on. So let's start our webinar with a keynote of one of the politically most influential German macroeconomists. Achim Truger is a professor at the University Duisburg-Essen. He is a member of the German Sachverständigenrat. He has published widely on fiscal policy and reform of fiscal rules, and he will have opened doors in the next Federal Chancellor's office. So Achim, thank you very much for joining us today, and we are looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Markus. Thank you very much, Beatrice. I'm very glad to be here and have the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. I will now try to share my slides, and yes, that seems to work. Can you see the slides?
Yes, it's working.
That's fantastic. Okay, so just briefly, I'm going to talk about, well, reforming EU fiscal rules, and so the key words here are more leeway, investment orientation, and democratic coordination. And just as some sort of advertisement, I would like to show you, this is a recent contribution to a forum in Intereconomics that I wrote with exactly the same title. And I would also like to show you this, the cover of my 2015 study for the Austrian Chamber of Labour about implementing the Golden Rule for public investment in Europe. So this is where most of what I'm now talking about is based on. Okay, so just briefly, what will I be talking about? I would first of all like to mention some of the well-known flaws of the existing fiscal rules in the European Union. Then would show you some more recent additional arguments, because I mean those flaws have been well known ever since the existing rules came into place, but obviously now after the Euro crisis and in recent times there are some more arguments. And then just some words about how to implement the reforms towards implementing the reforms. Can you also see the next slide? Does it work?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So now just a brief sketch of the flaws of the existing rules. We all know that those fiscal targets for fiscal policy, the 60% debt criterion, the 3% deficit criterion, and the 0.5% limit for the target for the structural budget balance. These are arbitrary and they are one-size-fits-all targets, and we all know that there's no economic justification for any of those exact numerical targets. It's more well based on the historical values at the time the rules were implemented, but we cannot say that these are in any way optimal targets for fiscal policy. Of course, I mean, I'm not advocating no fiscal rules, but it's about reforming fiscal rules and sticking to those one-size-fits-all targets. I think is problematic if the targets cannot be derived from economic theory or from empirical considerations. Well, closely related to this criticism is that the existing rules neglect the so-called golden rule for public investment. This is the rule that states that usually net public investment should be financed via government deficits. That's to do with intergenerational equity considerations, current well, future generations will of course benefit from public investment and a higher public capital stock in the future, and so it's only fair and rational that they should also bear some of the burden of financing the public investment. And via interest payments and the debt service, this is exactly what this golden rule strives for. Well, this is a traditional public finance rule, and at least some sort of investment orientation, I think, should be important, and it makes a difference whether you finance well, any government expenditure or whether you finance investment which has a capacity and growth effect, which is well documented in the literature. The third obvious criticism is that there is inherent in the application of the rules a cyclical adjustment, which is in principle well justified, but in practice is pro-cyclical, which means that whenever there is a recession, then potential output will be revised downwards, and this will then lead to a less leeway, cyclical leeway, less leeway than would be important for the full working of automatic stabilizers. Fourth criticism is that the current rules are extremely complex. You know that this rule book currently has some 100 pages or so. It's therefore also not transparent, and this of course hinders effective monitoring and compliance. And the fifth point of criticism is that the current rules lack welfare orientation and democratic procedures, very technocratic, and not much democratic control by either the European Parliament or national parliaments on what's happening and what the welfare consequences of those rules are. Okay, so this is basically it. Just briefly to show you some of the problems. This is taken from the Intereconomics contribution that I advertised. You can see that in the periphery, in the Euro crisis, in the EMU periphery, there was a brutal fall, a catastrophic fall in public investment. Obviously, it was easiest to cut there, and there was no protection from the rules that prevented that, which was bad, of course, for growth, for long-term growth, but also extremely bad because the multiplier of government investment is high, so that really aggravated the crisis tremendously. And the procyclicality of potential output calculations would maybe look like the technicality. This is, as we will be discussing with the Spanish Secretary of State, just to remind you that in Spain, if you look at just the dotted lines, then you see the blue one is the potential output growth estimate by the European Commission in 2007. Then after the crisis hit, this was really revised strongly downwards in the 2010 estimate or forecast. And it was even revised downwards more in 2014. And if you look at this, then in 2012 to 2015, actually, if the Spanish economy stagnated, this would have been signaling an upswing, a cyclical upswing, due to this calculations. And you cannot use this as a yardstick in order to base your fiscal policy on. Okay, so these are basically the well-known existing flaws. Now some recent additional arguments. Some of them have already been mentioned by Markus Marterbauer. First, I think, unfortunately, one must say, there was some sort of learning, but there was involuntary and very painful, a painful learning process. And I think it was learned, the lesson was learned that fiscal policy is much more effective, particularly in times of crisis. And also the role of of fiscal policy is very important. And that was exactly the recent multiplier debate, which has shown that particularly at the lower zero lower bound of monetary policy, fiscal policy is very effective. And if you cut spending or increase taxes in crisis, this will strongly hurt your economy. So this is a more recent finding that I think makes the whole thing more urgent. I already hinted at the zero lower bound. Markus has already told you that, of course, the cost-benefit analysis of public deficits and debt have changed due to very low or even negative interest rates. So borrowing is extremely cheap, and therefore keeping everything else constant, this would mean that we could afford a bit more of public deficits. So as was already mentioned, the need for public investment has increased. It's not only public investment, of course, but it's I think undebatable that the ecological transition will have to go hand in hand with increases in public investment, strong increases, and this will have to be financed. And one natural way would be at least to finance at least part of it via deficits. And one last additional recent argument is that I think it has by many people now been recognized that it will be impossible to return to the current rules, this 1/20th debt rule after the corona crisis. The European Fiscal Board has already said that either you try to strictly enforce the rules, which will not work, because that would mean a return to austerity, or else you would have to bend extremely to the current rules, which would of course further undermine credibility of those rules. So really sticking to this, particularly to this debt rule, will not work if you take the debt rule seriously. After, the public debt level was high in many member countries, but it's now, after the corona crisis, even much higher, and it will be extremely difficult to return to 60% of GDP within only 20 years. And the calculations that you can do is that this would mean for some years something like 1.5 or 2% consolidation effort every year, which means that the countries would return to austerity, and this would practically ruin growth prospects and would never be feasible economically, and also not socially and politically. This, I think, would be the end of the euro. Okay, so these are some additional arguments just to show you, because I quite like it. The German Bundesbank has said that we should return to the rules because there's no compelling case even for 2022 to draw this general escape clause. But as you can see, this relies on footnote 27, which says that yes, there is a problem with the debt criterion of the Stability and Growth Pact, but that in the past this was not strictly enforced. So basically, by raising those points here, the Bundesbank actually agrees with my statement that either you change the rules, or you simply disobey or bend the rules. And I'm a bit astonished that obviously the Bundesbank seems to be in favor of bending the rules, but that's maybe something that should not go unnoticed. All right, now the last point, implementing the reforms. Just briefly, I think what the minimum requirement that would be needed is, I think we would need country-specific targets, or at least intermediate targets, at least for the debt level, or the speed of adjustment would have to be much slower for some countries, and that's something that would have to be country-specific. I think we need investment orientation, as I said. So either the deficit targets would have to be corrected for net investment spending, or if you look at the expenditure rule, then expenditure for investment should be excluded, or expenditure growth should be excluded from that rule in order to stabilize and enable more investment. And also one technicality, as I said, which is, I think, important, is that more stable potential output estimates should be used, and or average growth rates, potential output growth rates should be used, which are very stable in the expenditure rule. So I think, as also Marcus has already mentioned, the current times are rather favorable for implementing reforms, and I think the current review of the economic governance should be used to implement new rules. And I think the good news is that much of those changes, many of the changes, should even be possible without treaty change, and maybe even without the requirement of unanimity. I think that most of what I showed to you, the 3 points, could well be realized without unanimous decisions. And one other thing, it may be for political reasons, the French presidential election and also the German well, formation of a new government will take some time. And so maybe we're already a bit late to change the rules for 2023. Politically could be difficult to reach agreement before, but then I think the minimum requirement is that it should be made very clear that the return to the current rules in 23, if we want to return to them, would only be transitory, and that we would simply be waiting for the result of the review and the corresponding changes. But what should be avoided is a naive return to the rules, which would then maybe surprise some people that it will not be possible to stick exactly to the debt criterion. And this should not be come as a surprise for anybody. We know that already. Everybody who's sensible knows this, and therefore we cannot pretend that we will go through this process without any change. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for that presentation, indeed, which I think very much set the tone for the discussion that we're about to have. I have many comments and questions for you because you highlight many of the points that I think are going to be the most controversial in the discussion that we're going to see between the ministers in the coming months, if not years, as you said, because this is going to be a very difficult discussion and we cannot be sure that we will have an answer for all those questions very soon. But then at the same time that we have political constraint, right, like the formation of the government in Germany, the elections in France, but also many others that might come before that final discussion about how we can reform the fiscal rules. I was thinking about this question of the one fit size for all between versus the question of a specific country recommendations, which I think it's going to be very relevant considering the differences between the different member states. I was thinking about how we can anyway avoid a debt crisis after these COVID-19 crisis that put governments in a position where public investment was absolutely a must, while at the same time, as you mentioned, we also need a lot of investment to pursue the green transition. A lot of questions, a lot of topics that I want to touch. And for that, I am going to be welcoming now our amazing lineup of the speakers. So I would like to introduce to you Nacho Alvarez, who is the Spanish Secretary of State for Social Rights, Gilles Mouret, who is the head of unit working on fiscal policy and surveillance at DG ECFIN at the European Commission, and Evelyn Regner, who is a member of the European Parliament and a member of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee at the European Parliament, and Mr. Struger, who is going to stay with us for this discussion as well. And the first person, I'm going to ask my panelists to turn their cameras on because I'm not able to see them, but I'm not sure if this is just a technical question or is that they are not there anyway. So just in case. And I would like to have straight away a reaction to the presentation of Mr. Regner about all the different points that he highlighted. And I want to give the floor first to the Secretary of State. How do you see this discussion from the Spanish perspective, considering how strongly Spain has been advocating to a reform of these rules, especially to allow for more flexibility when it comes to those two targets of debt and deficit? I think you're muted. We can't hear you and see you. If you could please turn your camera on. And now I think we hear you very badly, though. Very badly, I am afraid, and we cannot see you. I'm going to leave my colleagues try to solve these technical issues with you, if that's okay. And no, we can see you now. Can you please talk a little bit?
Yeah, good morning. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now it's good. Now it's good. So please, sorry, you have
okay.
a short reaction to the presentation.
Okay, thank you. I guess you can hear me now. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this debate. And I would like to react to the very interesting opening speech delivered by Achim Truger by first pointing out that even before the pandemic, I would say that European rules were being widely questioned in academic and certain political circles, basically for two main reasons. First, many people and many academics had become aware that the negative effect that the austerity policies developed during the Great Recessions had precisely as a consequence of the application of the European fiscal rules. But I would say also that there was a second reason to explain the questioning of the European fiscal rules before the pandemic, and that is the change in the macroeconomic scenario, and in particular the possibility that a situation of secular stagnation was taking place in a context of historically low interest rates. And then the pandemic crisis came, and this pandemic crisis has finally overcome this scenario, forcing, I would say, academics, politicians, and also institutions to carry out a deeper reconsidering of the European fiscal framework. And there are several factors that explain this need for deeper reconsidering. Of course, the brutality of the crisis forced the adoption of unprecedented decisions, and in particular, the creation of a common fund for economic recovery. But also, the different member states have applied expansionary fiscal policies that have raised their debt levels far beyond the theoretical limits established by the current rules. And therefore, there is a broad consensus that reducing these debt levels at the rate necessary to meet the current rules will have a very negative effect on European economies. So I would say that it is simply not possible to go back where we were before the pandemic. We are not at the point where we must, I would say that we are at the point where we must undertake profound changes in the European rules. And I will say that the most important lesson that we have and that we can learn from the past 30 years in which the Stability and Growth Pact has been enforced is that its main problem, it is not one of institutional design, but rather that it is based on a wrong model of the functioning of the economy and on the functioning of and on the role of fiscal policy. And therefore, this debate should not only focus on introducing improvements in the design of the rules to make them simpler or more transparent or more effective, but also and mainly about carrying out a thorough review of the European economic policy framework. I will say that it is the time to be ambitious, and I don't want to take a lot of time, but I will say that we can point out some lessons learned from these last years that justify overcoming these current fiscal policy rules. We can basically say that fiscal policy matters. Expansionary austerity completely failed during the last decade. It caused a second recession, it is known, but I would say more importantly, it even increased indeed the debt to GDP ratio. This can be called the debt paradox. Restrictive fiscal policies in the context of a fall in demand do not ensure debt sustainability, but the opposite. And this was confirmed, in fact, by the review of the fiscal policy multipliers carried out during the last decade by international organizations and also by empirical literature. And I would say that the experience of these last years have also shown that fiscal policy has not only matters in the short term, but has lasting consequences in the medium term, either due to the negative effects that austerity policies permanent cause, the hysteresis phenomenon, but also due to the positive effects on productivity that public investments have. So I would say that these are sufficient arguments not only to use fiscal policy proactively and quickly when there is a fall in aggregate demand to logically prevent its effects from becoming permanent, but also these are sufficient arguments to design fiscal policy strategies in the medium term that ensure the full utilization of this instrument. And beyond that, the sustainability of public finances, it is a logical, necessary goal but unrealistic rules, which do not take into account the specific circumstances of each country, have indeed a high cost and are I would say, the wrong way to seek this sustainability. And the main conclusion to me will be that the main conclusion that we can draw from these lessons that we have learned during the last decade is that the current norms cannot be reinstated, or simply make formal changes or introduce some dose of temporal flexibility without questioning the backbone of this fiscal framework. Fiscal policies cannot continue to be designed with the main objective of achieving certain levels of debt or public deficit. Fiscal policy must recover its genuine objectives, which are, of course, to contribute to the full use of productive capacity and full employment. And this does not have to do does not have to do with reaching the same debt threshold in all countries at a certain rate at the same time. Sustainability, of course, it is important, it is crucial, I will say, but public debt sustainability, it depends on the budget balance, it depends on the interest rates, it depends on the growth rate, which in turn is a variable dependent on fiscal policy. So it is necessary to suspend the current threshold of 3% and 60% and replace them with the presentation by the different governments of a fiscal policy plan, as Olivier Blanchard, for example, is putting forward in the international debate, that set out the objectives, the aims, the expenditure and income measures to be adopted by different governments and the effects on the main economic variables, including, of course, public debt. And that means also that the reference to a structural equilibrium, as it's been known so far, should be also removed. In the first place, because it's been demonstrated that the enormous difficulty in estimating this structural equilibrium, having made mistakes that have caused a pro-cyclical bias in fiscal policy, and particularly in recessions. And finally, in this approach, independent fiscal institutions will have a relevant role, from my point of view, when evaluating with a pre-established methodology that, of course, has to be discussed within the European governments, but the plausibility of the fiscal and macroeconomic forecasts that justify the plans presented by the governments, of course, has to be evaluated by these independent bodies and institutions, but the role will be limited to this technical aspect, with political bodies being responsible for decision-making and for economic policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Indeed, I see that you're very much in line with the presentation that Mr. made in terms of the long-term impact and the medium-term impact of austerity. Indeed, and we have seen over the pandemic, right, like how many countries like Spain, but also others, were affected by those policies in the years that followed the economic crisis, that actually left the government with their hands tied when it comes to public investment, but also this need to adapt the rules to the different countries and their economic circumstances. But I would like to ask you a little bit more later about the case in particular in Spain, and how do you see this need to adapt the rules to make sure that it fits the economic situation of the country. But before, I would like to have a reaction as well from the European Commission. Mr. Moore, you have heard from our speakers so far these strong criticism towards the existing fiscal rules in the European Union and the need for a change. That need for a change has been acknowledged by the European Commission, that is now preparing a new proposal to establish a dialogue with the member states for a reform. How do you see this criticism? How do you take this presentation from Mr. Trudeau, and how do you feel about these points that were made?
No, thank you very much. Thank you for Professor Truger, and thank you for the panelists. Let me before going to the substance, let me say where we stand in the review. As you may know, the Commission has issued on 5th February 2020 a review purely backward-looking of the functioning of its economic governance framework, including the fiscal rules. Following that release, a consultation was launched. Unfortunately, COVID struck in Europe exactly at the same time, and actually this consultation had to be put on hold in order to face the emergency of an unprecedented public health and economic crisis. So the review was put on hold, but the Commission is a communication issue in March 2021 said that once the recovery takes hold, the Commission will resume the review. And actually, in a speech, and this is actually the latest official position by the Commission, in her speech on the State of the Union on 15 September this year, the President von der Leyen stressed three things. She stressed the need to reflect on how the crisis has affected the shape of our economy, from increased debt to also increased economic heterogeneity. And I quote, she said, to do that, the Commission will relaunch the discussion on the economic governance review in the coming week. And let me try to give my interpretation of this sentence. Clearly, by mentioning the economic governance review, the Commission wants to cover not only the EU fiscal rule, but the EU fiscal rule within the broader framework of economic policy, including, for instance, the macroeconomic imbalances procedure. The consultation, open public consultation, should resume in the coming week. It means that it has not started now, but very soon. And she concluded by saying, I quote, "The aim is to build a consensus on the way forward well in time for 2023. So 2023 will be the time where the general escape clause will be lifted. The general escape clause is actually a provision in the Stability and Growth Pact, allowing the Commission to basically temporarily suspend the normal operation of the pact, and this has been done in March 2020 in order to allow member states to develop very large public spending to fight the pandemic. But the wording is important. She is not saying that we will come, the Commission will come up with a legislative proposal. She said the aim is to build a consensus on the way forward. So without going, basically, as far as explaining what will be the form of such outcome, I think the President highlighted the method. And building consensus is very important because views are extremely polarized in Europe. So there is a consensus about the need to change the rule, to adapt the rule, but there is no strong consensus even on the key challenge and on the diagnosis. So it's why I think that a first step will be also to encourage the observer and the academics to look at the Commission review, because many of the challenge identified there remain true. And I will mention it very quickly, but you will see they dovetail quite well in many instances with what Professor Truger have said. So, for instance, the review, so the March 2020 review, was saying that while the aggregate debt to GDP ratio began to decline, I think in 2015, that dynamic has widely diverged across member states. And the framework did not ensure a sufficient differentiation between member states with markedly different fiscal position, sustainability risk, and over vulnerability. The preventive arm of the framework has been less effective than the corrective arm, and actually some countries follow it. Large economy tend to actually depart from it. And the debt reduction benchmark, the so-called debt rule, was not used. So I agree with Professor Truer that it's extremely stringent, pro-cyclical, but in fact, I mean, the Commission has never opened an EDP based on this debt reduction benchmark. This was identified in the review. The second aspect, so this was for the fiscal sustainability. Regarding macroeconomic stabilization, I mean, the Commission emphasized in the review that a member state's fiscal policy remain pro-cyclical. But let's be no mistake. Is it because the rules are pro-cyclical, or it is because the fiscal policy tend to be pro-cyclical regardless of the attempt of the rule to correct that? And we think that it's a second aspect, because we can see that all member states who follow the rule generally tend to have a much less pro-cyclical pattern. I mean, people emphasize often the situation of crisis, but they neglect the fact that macro policy, as fiscal policy, has not been, in many countries, has been highly pro-cyclical in good time, and member states fail to actually build cyclical buffer, which represent extremely useful fiscal space in bad times. So, and a fiscal policy has tended to have a very difficulty to actually enforce some fiscal restraint in good time. So, the use of the output gap has been problematic, indeed, and this has been widely recognized, also by the previous speaker. And it's why the Commission moved toward the spending rule, the expenditure benchmark, which is more observable and actually more consistent with the national, the way national budgetary procedure work in practice. The third takeaway was that the fiscal framework has not sufficiently preserved the level of public investment during period of fiscal consolidation, and public finance has not become growth friendly. So this is also an important message. And there were other messages more on the governance. I mean, the Commission highlighted the complexity of the EU fiscal rule, including the multiplicity of indicators and the reliance of unobservable variable. I mentioned it. The framework lacked transparency, and its complexity hamper ownership and predictability. Lastly, the development of national fiscal framework and independent fiscal institution had increased national ownership of fiscal policy. However, the effectiveness of national fiscal framework differ across countries. So, of course, so basically all this challenge seems to be even more relevant in the context of the crisis. So it's why we need to draw actually the lesson of the crisis and the lesson from the successful policy response to the crisis. I could mention, for instance, the EU instrument SURE and RRF. The RRF's contract-based approach to policy coordination has allowed strong national ownership of policy design and outcome. And it has been accompanied also by a transparent and publicly available assessment and monitoring framework, which help actually foster a common understanding and trust in the implementation of the policy. So I stop it here, but in a nutshell, what I want to say is to summarize these three things. The review will be resumed soon, and we will need, the name of the game will be to listen, to understand various positions, and crucially, build consensus. Two, I think it could be good to look at the review, which has been understandably overshadowed by the crisis, but I think it was a balanced assessment, which was praised at the time, just before the pandemic, to try to have a fair account of what have happened in a non-complacent way. And three, of course, we will need to draw the lesson of the crisis and the lesson of the crisis response. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mrs. Moore. Indeed, I'm very glad because you mentioned something that we haven't discussed yet, but I think it is genuinely something very important in this discussion. Is the question of how the IRF has been perceived as the carrot in this question, right? We have seen not a lot of motivation for countries to pursue macroeconomic reforms, and with the IRF, we're kind of like trying to motivate the member states to do that with the support of not only financial support, but also technical support on the side of the European Commission to make sure that we don't only have more growth and a recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, but also that countries are more resilient to shocks like we have seen. They were not able to react in the case of the financial crisis a few years ago. But you were talking about the consensus as well, and how the Commission is going to have to deal with different positions from member states in this debate. And I wanted to turn now to Ms. Regner about this, because however I feel that her position might differ from her government in Austria. This is one of the countries that has the strongest stand in defense of the return of the rules as soon as possible. And I was wondering what her perspective is, considering the presentation that we listened today too, and also the inputs of the other speakers so far. Ms. Regner, you there?
Excellent. Good afternoon. Definitely. I hope you can hear me. You can see me. Okay. So definitely, this is something I can underline. My position as a member of the European Parliament, representing workers, representing those who feel what's happening around, is definitely not the one represented by the Austrian government. So I would like to say a big thank you to the presentation of Achim, and just put in the beginning of this was what I regard as so important. Rules are never l'art pour l'art. When rules are created, always the goal, what we would like to achieve, should be ahead of us. And if we see those rules fail and we don't reach our goals, our targets, they should be revised, and there is a reform needed. So what I get as a conclusion from the presentation of Achim, the Stability and Growth Pact needs urgently of reform. And of course, it needed it already before. I mean, when we're just looking back to the financial social crisis we had after 2008, it's so clear with austerity measures. You won't save a country, you do only harm to people, and it's devastating on economy. So somehow altogether, a revision of the Stability and Growth Pact is needed. And I come to the point also politically to come there, we need, and everybody knows that, we need investments. I mean, we are just in midst of the climate change, digitalization. We need the education system, universities, everything that is related to future needs an absolute change, and this needs the big investments, and not just how can we inspire some enterprises in order to catch up. So, and with this, it is clear, in order to reach it, we need this change of the Stability and Growth Pact. And then we're also always asking, how is this feasible? And so I see it just get out of Achim's paper, tax policy being seen in a broader multi-level governance framework, aimed, for example, at the well-being of people. So he brings it on the point, because we have to see that 1% of the society holds the wealth of more or less 32% of the total wealth. And when you're just looking at the figures, the situation is clear. So a revision of the Stability and Growth Pact needed. And then coming back to this point, what is politically possible? Because one thing is what we know, what people need, what is needed from an economic standpoint when getting through all the arguments, and then you just have those being on the brakes and say, oh God, we are the frugal four, and there is this not sufficient trust in each other's systems. And therefore, I'm just directly referring to back what we are debating in the European Parliament. And of course, being in a very close, in a very good contact with Commissioner Gentiloni, but also with others dealing with the issues. We learned right now from the Corona crisis, from the RRF, from all the instruments, methods we just apply right now, that we need a system that is rules that are simple, transparent, democratically really based, and therefore we just see in the whole governance system we need a huge change, and we can learn from this RRF system, from this method we're doing right now, and therefore I just bring it in. I mean, I'm sure, I just tell you, one thing is sure, we need public investments, therefore the golden rule of public investments, which is clear, and we need these investments, and we need the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact. And we're just coming to the question how to come there, having all this resistance. And I mean, I'm aware of the resistance, and therefore we just only shouldn't talk about what would be nice and necessary, but also how we could come there. Different methods and different ways are in discussion, either to more or less develop instruments from the general escape clause. So to say, okay, we have the foot in the door. We just learned right now how it is and how we could work with more flexibility, how we could build on that. The other thing that even the most conservative finance ministers, I think they must learn that we need those investments. So somehow they also have to find a way in order to do a reform of the Stability and Growth Pact without saying it. Sometimes I just have the impression, of course, we would like to have in the future of the Europe debate that this is an issue, but if it is not possible because of political reasons that it's too difficult to get a majority or whatever, we have to find other means, instruments in order to do what is more or less in the content, this reform of the Stability and Growth Pact, but with other means like permanent general escape clause, minimum standards. So simply to build on all that that is around them, or, and this is the other debate right now on the table, to take another big instrument like the RRF, that is called this huge future investment fund, and they're doing then what we are doing when claiming for the golden rule of investment.
Thank you so much. Indeed, you actually made very easy my transition, because I wanted to get back to the Secretary of State about this question of investment, because indeed one of the main evolutions that we have seen, it was this creation of the RRF, because it was a different way of using the European budget and to put in money into trying to help countries, as I said before, to reform their economies, to make sure that they do not only work in the short term, but that we have investments and reforms that might do more resilient economies, that might transform their economies. But there is this discussion, right, about whether these instruments should be just one-time fund that it's used in case of a crisis like the one we're experiencing now, or should it be a permanent instrument that might help countries to overcome these economic difficulties? So I wanted to get the reaction from the Secretary of State about the situation in Spain right now. Do you think that, considering the level of public investment that we have seen few months to overcome the crisis as a result of the pandemic, that require that level of investment, do you think that the money coming from the RRF and the potential flexibility that the Stability and Growth Pact might bring into the policy making is enough to pursue those reforms in Spain to make sure that the Spanish economy is more resilient, or do you think that we should find another way of overcoming these difficulties?
Well, thank you for the question. Of course, Spain needs to invest in climate change and digitalization, and without any doubt, and many other fields, and without any doubt, I would say the the European transfers, the Next Generation Fund, and other funds will allow addressing these investments.
Ask you to turn your camera on, please. Sorry.
Is it on already?
Not really. I don't know why. I think it takes a little while though. I will let my colleagues say you can keep on talking.
Is it already on, Beatriz?
No, it's okay, but you can go ahead.
Okay.
I think it's more important to hear you than we see you.
Sorry. I was saying that of course Spain needs to invest in certain crucial investments such as climate change or digitalization, and without any doubt the EU transfers and the Next Generation Fund will allow addressing these investments in the coming years without strong fiscal constraints, without strong fiscal restrictions. And they will also boost recovery due to the multiplier effect, of course. So I would say it is an European decision that goes in the right direction. However, this does not diminish the need to profoundly modify the Stability and Growth Pact. First, from the point of view of Spain, because the EU transfers will be exhausted precisely in 2023, but the investment needs for Spain are not exhausted in that year. Nor are they limited to climate change or digitalization. Spain also needs to reinforce other policies in which we clearly find ourselves behind the European average, such as the development of our welfare state. Second, because Spain continues to have an unacceptable unemployment rate that it is necessary to continue reducing. And third, I will say, because the evidence of these years has taught us that the Stability and Growth Pact is based on a wrong model that prevents fiscal policy from playing the role it should play. So, resuming, yes, we are moving in the right direction. Of course, the transfers coming from the European Union and the fiscal capacity build-up during this pandemic crisis has been, I would say, a great step forward. But we continue, at least on certain countries, we continue to have important investments to accomplish during the next years, and that entails, that needs to profoundly modify the Stability and Growth Pact.
Indeed, because we're talking about long-term, right? Not only the short-term investments that we have to pursue in the coming years, but also thinking about the structural issues that countries might be facing, like it's the case with unemployment in Spain. I'm going to get back to Ms. Regner about this question, because we were talking about the need to build consensus, right? But also the European Parliament is part of this process. And I was wondering what her experience is in terms of negotiate, at least having informal chats with other colleagues. Is there at the European Parliament a common position on how these rules should be reformed to accommodate all these challenges that Mr. Truger explained before? Or do we still have to also build a consensus within the European Parliament that might increase the pressure on member states to get an agreement?
I mean, of course, I'm not the speaker for the whole European Parliament on these questions, and we have indeed different positions. This has to be underlined. But as I mentioned before, concerning the general escape clause, we already have the majority of the European Parliament who is in favor to say, okay, until 2022, we want this flexibility, and also to look and to make a reassessment how we can say that, to apply that also for the future. I have to admit, it's not written in there, and this was really part of the negotiations, and of course it was not easy to get, that it's longer. So, but we put in, it has to be reassessed, and it is one of those doors we opened, and we would like to remain open in order to go there where it's needed. What all the other issues are concerned, at the moment I'm a little bit, let me say, a little bit optimistic, because we are learning also from this, what we're doing. We had the German elections last weekend, so somehow I really would also say that there is a change on the political approach that was happening in the last years. So we can't act and do anymore as if the situation was as it had been before the coronavirus. So political systems changes, and also even conservative parties get a little bit more open-minded. So that was right now quite very diplomatic, but I would go deeper because we are learning right now a lot. When we negotiated the RRF, the Recovery and Resilience Fund, the Parliament was included. We had a role, we had a say, and we put a lot what was important and is important for us into it. There was, as you know, the mechanism on respecting the rule of law. So when we are talking about money, when we are talking about everything that has to be done within our economic systems, we never should forget that we are a union also of values. So somehow it makes a sense. And therefore all economic question, fiscal policy is linked to it, because it's never a la pour la. And what we learned out of that is democratic participation. The European members, the members of the European Parliament are democratically elected. They just make a difference if they have a role in it, just in comparison to what we see when we do our work on the European semester. So it's a complete different situation. We put in arguments like the rule of law argument, and even gender equality is in there. So somehow when you're just going for this task that is always happening, taking place between member states and the Commission, it makes a difference if those being democratically elected playing a crucial role in it, and is good for the citizens, and therefore also for fiscal policies for citizens, for people, for working people as such. And of course also referring to the golden rule of investment. And these arguments, they created something like a momentum within the European Parliament. So one could never have thought that in the Econ Committee or in the Budget Committee, there were those where we're debating those rules, the question of the rule of law is an integral part of the whole issue, or that gender mainstreaming. I mean, is the money really there delivered where it should be? What does it mean for women employers, employed people? What for men? That somehow all this horizontally is integrated, and therefore I see really something like a momentum also in the work of the members of the European Parliament through the RRF. We got sort of a power, we got sort of a way of being included, and that creates something also amongst party borders, allies, in order to say, okay, we should have we should have a say on the whole governance framework as it is changed in the future, and therefore maybe on some political points like always debt policy and all this that might be quite difficult sometimes. But all in all, I see that there is a change in this regard, and this is also something where I hope very much that Commission and Member States take that on board. As we can see also that here Member States became versus the Commission a different role. Normally when you're just referring to the European semester, it's more or less the Commission looking, okay, there are the goals, there is the budget, did you do your homework, did you do everything, and then finally it ends always up, you have to save, and you have to make higher the age when you get retired, and all these things that are not nice. And with the RRF method, it was the member states themselves who made proposals. How is the money used, to somehow look into the situation in the countries, but under a certain conditionality that I mentioned before. So I think we can learn from that also for everything that has to be done in the future.
Thank you so much for that, because indeed I want to get a reaction from Mr. Moore about this question. First of all, of that new framework indeed that the Recovery and Resilience Facility has created. With first of all, we have more involvement of the European Parliament, as Ms. Regner was explaining, but also this question of the extra motivation of member states to pursue the reforms within the European semester that they might not have in other circumstances. And considering all these that you are listening to today, all the reactions between the different speakers, how that can fit into that discussion inside the European Commission that might be taking place now to come up with a concrete proposal on how to reform the rules? Are we going to see this question of the golden rule that we know that both Vice President Dombrovskis but also Commissioner Gentiloni have been advocating for? Are we going to see further integration of the economic policies of the member states to make sure that there is no this one-size-fits-all rule applying to each and all of them? Are we going to see more involvement of the European Parliament? I know you cannot tell me everything, but can you give me a hint on what we could expect from the European Commission in this reform?
I mean, no, thank you for your question, but let's be clear. I cannot speak on behalf of the College of Commissioners, so I should learn my place, and I think I think this is done. No, I mean, I just want to stress that the consultation has not started. It will start soon, but it has not started. Of course, we are very happy. I'm taking a lot of notes to hear out, because this will be also the name of the game, basically airing out the different views, which sometimes are very polarized, knowing that the end game is to build a consensus. So, clearly, I mean, the lesson for the crisis will be important. We consider certainly that ownership is something which has been embodied in the RF, has been embodied also in SURE, for instance, where 95 billion have been granted by the Council to member states. I take, for instance, the example of Spain. Spain received 23 billion in the context of SURE, and member states, I mean, in the case of SURE, for instance, which was a precursor of RF, was allowing full ownership of member states, because you have a very, basically member states were free to decide which measure they should put in place and how to put them in place given their particular challenges. They just have to be eligible to show that their spending on short-time work scheme and equivalent has massively increased. But this, we can see that in the case of RF and the case of SURE, for which we have, let's say, the benefit of hindsight, we can see that this ownership method worked very clearly. On the issue of investment, I think you're right, all speakers has emphasized that. I think we certainly has to reflect how a fiscal rule can incentivize investment, digital investment, green investment. I think the issue is clear. How to do that is still a matter of debate. There is different view. So we will be also happy to, again, hear out the different side. But I just want to tell you that when you look at member states' position on fiscal rule, they are very different. And they tend to be different camp and very entrenched views. So we will need to hear out the view, but at some point there will be a need for convergence toward commonly acceptable landing zone. So it's all what I can tell at this stage, but I think the challenges you highlighted are very well taken, and I think my policy masters are fully aware of those. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am sure our speakers are going to be very happy to know that you're taking notes and you're going to bring all this discussion into the conversation that I'm sure is happening at the European Commission. I would like to just get back to Mr. Truger to have a reaction from him about these interventions from our speakers in reaction to his presentation today, because many of the points that you have highlighted have been taken by them, but some others are a little bit more blurry. Are you confident about the Commission taking in your suggestions in the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact in the coming months?
Yes, well, the simple answer is yes, I am confident, because I'm obviously I'm not the only person saying this. It's true that, of course, some of the points are contested, but I think that the general view is that there has to be some change. I mean, that's what also the Commission has been saying so far. And also, I think if you look at the proposals by the European Fiscal Board, then even this important institution has already made some of the points that I took up and that were taken up in our discussion today. So what I would like to say, it's true that some of the different views are deeply entrenched in the different countries. But just as of course you know, we had the election last weekend in Germany, and I think that many people in the political parties will discover, or have already discovered, that it's not just playing the old game of basically being lucky with public finances, having strong export growth and consolidating public finances without any problem, and then blaming other countries which suffer from unfortunate circumstances. So I don't think that this game will continue, because obviously the investment need is huge, also for Germany, and that of course applies for many of the so-called frugals in Europe. And therefore, I think, and also it's not easy to recover from the Corona crisis and to consolidate easily. That's difficult, and therefore I think maybe there will be some common consciousness that it's not that easy, and that you cannot go on with that blame game. And that's what makes me fairly optimistic. There are so many initiatives, so many proposals on the table, and if some of those proposals some of the elements are taken up, then I think that this will be a huge step towards a better European fiscal governance. And then just to be even more optimistic, just think about what happens if some of the steps are actually taken, and if people recognize that it works. So if you see a decrease in unemployment, an increase in growth, if important climate investment is being delivered, you see that even the debt to GDP ratio will decrease. So you will maybe see an improvement in public finances, in growth, in employment, all of this. And so my hope would be that we can come to some sort of virtuous circle, when actually just the opposite of what we had in the Euro crisis. Why should this not be possible? I think it's times are favorable for that. I have never heard so many people saying well, reform-friendly things. And therefore, I think something will be taken up, and some good points will be taken, I'm sure.
Glad to see that you're very positive. I wanted to do a quick follow-up before when you did your presentation, but I skipped it to go into the other speakers, but I'm going to do it now. But before I do that, I want to remind our participants that they can actually ask their own questions. So if there is something that you would like to ask to our speakers and to be part of the conversation, you can do it. Leave your comment on the chat. I will be able to bring it into our conversation. You just leave your name maybe and your organization and a quick question for our speakers, because we're running out of time. So if you want to ask something, now is the time. So my follow-up for Mr. Truger was actually, because we were talking about these questions of the need to take the differences of the different member states into account when developing the rules. We have seen over the past few years the reform of the ECM and the question of further economic and fiscal coordination between the member states. Now with the Recovery and Resilience Facility, again, this issue came to discussion. And I was wondering, to what extent do you think that this could be an answer, indeed, not only the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact, but to some extent to find a way to further integrate the economic and policy, fiscal policies of the member states to make sure that those answers at European level actually make sense for different countries?
Well, I think that's a good question. I mean, the problem is that always when preparing such a talk, then of course you can't be too ambitious, and I didn't want to raise too many points. But of course the question of a fiscal capacity on the European level or Euro area level is important. And I don't think that in the end it will be possible to have the common currency without a fiscal capacity. So that's also something that's also a construction side. And also, to be optimistic, I mean, I don't think that it's politically feasible to have it all at the same time. That's really, there will be serious resistance to be overcome. But in the end, I think it's clear that a fiscal capacity is needed, and so therefore we would have to move towards more fiscal coordination and also fiscal federalism in the end. But that's maybe a second or third step. But I agree, yes.
A discussion for another day, indeed, but thank you for that. Maybe because we're running out of time and I don't see any questions coming from the chat, I'm going to get back to our speakers. First of all, I'd like to hear from the Secretary of State. I often try to, when I have these kind of discussions where I have different people with different backgrounds and a big question, I ask them for a wish. So I was wondering, what is for you the ideal outcome of these negotiations about the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact and all these issues that we have been discussing today, all the many ways in which the European Union could support public investment in member states, but also to make sure that there is budgetary stability in the long term. So what do you think is the ideal outcome of this conversation that we need to have about the reform of the fiscal rules?
Well, I would say that economic coordination among member states, countries, is the best way. There's no doubt about that. And I think that we all have a strong work together in order to convince each other of the needs that we specifically have as countries, but also the needs that we all together as member states of the Eurozone do have. And that's important because the effects of investments, for example, in climate change, that all European countries have to develop during the next decades are non-national investments, since they don't have national effects. They can be largely considered an international public goods. And therefore, I will clearly advocate for this economic coordination within the context of the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact. For example, so far much emphasis has been placed on the possible negative externalities that that a possible reform of the Stability and Growth Pact might have in terms of an unsustainable fiscal policy of a certain country and the impact on other countries. But this possibility, I would say that it's been greatly exaggerated in the context of low interest rates and with the role of the European Central Bank developed during the last years. This risk is basically it's much lower, and especially I would say that we have another possible externalities of the fiscal policy of one country that has not to be forgotten. For example, with the strict application in the coming years of the current stability and growth pact, we will produce a new recession in the European Union, in the Eurozone, and this will have, of course, this will end up affecting the intra-European trade. So I think that we need to look forward and to work forward for this new fiscal framework based on economic coordination, of course, based on the need to guarantee the sustainability of public finances, but taking also into account the needs, the specific needs that countries do have in terms of using the fiscal instrument and the fiscal policy. The experience of the last decades has taught us that let me call the orthodox alternative, and particularly the fiscal and wage competition within the Eurozone is an unsustainable model that ends up causing a deflationary trend, but for everyone within the whole Eurozone.
Thank you so much for that very interesting overview of all the many things that we absolutely need to do to make sure that we have more sustainable finance, but also better coordination of economic and monetary policy as well. Because this is something that we haven't talked about, but obviously the role here of the ECB is absolutely essential to make sure that everything works together. As actually Mr. Drew was saying at the beginning, right? Like this alignment between fiscal and monetary policies is absolutely key to ensure that stability in the long term. I actually have few questions coming from the audience now, so I'm going to have to wait a little bit to give the floor to Ms. Regner about this wish that she might want to share with us. And I have a question actually coming from Michael Ringrunberg from the Ministry of Social Affairs from Austria. This question is actually for Mr. Truger, and he's asking, does a retirement age of 67 for men and women by 2060 help to cover aging costs and help also to stabilize the overall economic demand?
Okay, so to be honest, I wouldn't want to interfere with national Austrian retirement policies or pension policies. I'm not aware of your system, but I wouldn't see a natural connection with what we are talking about, because I mean somebody would have to pay for the pensions, and I'm not aware of any simulations that would tell me how that would work.
That's all right. Thank you so much. We have another question that I don't know to whom it is addressed, but I think it probably you could. Yeah, we have an answer now. Yeah, to the whole point, I was going to say that, so that's brilliant. So whoever wants to jump in, it's welcome. And I think this is a question that we have seen being addressed at the Spanish level, which is the country that I know the most. And it's coming from the Association of Cities and Towns in Austria. And the question is, should the local level be excluded from the rules at all, as it has nearly impossible to break the rules down to municipality levels? And this is indeed a question that we have seen in many member states, right? Like the local and regional level being constrained by the expenditure at national level, whereas they actually did have fiscal room to further invest public money at local level. So I was wondering who would like to jump in and react to this question of the need to exclude the local authorities from the limit of public investment within the fiscal rules. Who would like to jump in? Maybe Mr. Agnes, go ahead.
I don't have an explicit direct answer on the question, because of course it sounds very understandable, because what should the very local level do when you are strangled, when you just have the commission in there and the rules and so on, and then it's coming to the lowest level and everybody says, and you have to fulfill right now A, B, C, D, and this is impossible. The answer is the whole method, the instrument is wrong, because how the local level is included in the whole procedure is my question right now. And the same thing to to the previous question concerning retirement age of 67 or and so on. Of course, it's impossible for Armin to answer the question, but the question is, who is asking that people should work until 67? Who is saying you at a local level you should fulfill all these things? This can happen simply because those involved are not enough included. And therefore, just really would like to bring in the whole method how rules are drafted and then implemented, that inclusion is so important. We realized it right now with the, I'm jumping again to the RRF, because here we did a couple of good experiences where we can learn for the whole semester procedure and everything around. In those countries that said, okay, we include social partners, we ask the trade unions, we take representatives from the local communities on board, we ask them right now, what is needed? Those submitted far more robust national action plans that are really worth of being implemented. And when I just get an answer like this right now, then I see that this is a disaster concerning the whole implementation of all those rules, because it's impossible to fill something with no means in the hands. So the conclusion must be far stronger inclusion, but real one, not only on the paper where I can say, okay, I have asked the Chamber of Labor or the trade unions or the representatives of city councils, real inclusion in all this procedure. And this is something we must include with the revision that has to happen, because otherwise it's impossible. And therefore completely understanding for that question, even when it's right now difficult to say, okay, then if the rules are as they are right now, yes, they should be excluded, because otherwise you can't implement.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, because indeed you answered both questions, which was very, very helpful. Maybe just a quick short reaction before we finish the debate today from Mr. Moore on this question about the need to exclude maybe the local level from the fiscal rules, or how to reconcile both the national and local level when it comes to fiscal rules, because we have seen that indeed these create tensions within member states.
Okay, it worked. I think I managed to unmute myself. Thank you. I think, I mean, my answer would be twofold. First is that the Stability and Growth Pact, I think, is a primary, originally, goal was to avoid growth policy error, basically massive budgetary slippage from member states, and clearly it was up to member states as a sovereign state to decide freely their fiscal policy, the quality of their public finance, the decomposition of spending and of tax revenue. So the pact, it was just a safeguard, recognizing that we are in a monetary union with, on the one hand, a common monetary policy and a common central bank, and on the other hand, decentralized sovereign states and decentralized fiscal policy. So the pact is certainly not to meddle in the affair of member states. So it will be actually is up to member states to decide how they manage internally the different level of government. I understand that this is particularly important in federal country or country with strong regional autonomy. But my second level, first level of response, actually, the pact, is about safeguard to member states' policy, and we should not be intrusive. Second is the fact that since the six-pack package reforming actually the Stability and Growth Pact, This one has been augmented by a directive on national fiscal framework, and which basically try to have some level of standardization of fiscal framework developed at national level. And one element was indeed the development of national independent fiscal institution. But in this dialogue member state has on the national framework, the issue of fiscal federalism, how the different level of government play with each other, has also been an important point of the debate and the exchange of good practice. But here again, I mean, you have some states which are much more federal or with stronger regional autonomy, and you have some member states which have a more centralized functioning. This is the beauty of Europe, actually, a commonality in the diversity. So this show that actually this dimension has been discussed and reflected, but is not strictly part of the monitoring of the Stability and Growth Pact for the reason I mentioned. It's essentially a matter of national prerogative. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Moret. I have many questions that I would love to ask to our speakers, and I am sure that we could have this discussion for hours, because it's indeed what's going to happen for months between ministers. But we're coming to an end of this event today, and I want to thank all the speakers for their very insightful contribution, and all the participants also for being part of the conversation, but also for following and being there with us during this afternoon. But if you want to continue talking about these issues, you still can join the next session of this Fiscal Matters Week, which is actually about this question that we were talking about before, about the need to build consensus that those member states are not so willing to move into the reform of the fiscal rules. That's the conversation happening right now. So you have to jump into the next session. It's the Frugal Four and the European Fiscal Rules, Discipline or Expansion. So if you want to join that conversation, you can do it straight away. Otherwise, AKA Europe and OGB European Bureau, it's still organizing more conferences in the coming months and weeks. And on the 13th of October, we have another one, Effective Minimum Tax Implementation in the EU. So thank you so much again to everyone for being here today with us, and hopefully see you soon.